Joining me today on Decent Cities is Dr. Jordan Peterson. It's a huge honor.
Thanks, sir.
I know we have a limited amount of time, so I'm just going to dive straight in. Blockchain. We're working on projects for decentralized virtual metacities, and so we're looking at new ways to organize communities. One of the interesting facets about blockchain is it is an amazingly powerful tool for human coordination. And if we look at sort of the great human coordinators throughout history, you have first, obviously, religion, you have government, and then most recently the corporation, all of which share a top-down hierarchical structure. With blockchain now, you especially with global connectivity, you have a chance to take some of the power that was derived and held from in that top-down hierarchy and distribute that out on an opt-in basis. So have you done any thinking on how that paradigm shift could affect social hierarchies?
Well, I'm in favor of the standard conservative dictum, which is that the lowest level of organization, the most local level of organization possible, is the right level of organization for any given structure, for any given society or hierarchy. So to the degree that blockchain can serve that function, blockchains can serve that function, then, well, conceivably they might be a force for good. Certainly the Bitcoin experiment is an interesting one. Mm-hmm. And, who knows how that will turn out. But you put down your money and you take your chances. And so we'll see. I'm not conversant enough with the details of the technology to really be able to comment intelligently on it, although the fact that it can't be interfered with top down, at least in principle, it's interesting, it's freeing, but you also wonder what might happen if we institute systems that in some sense cannot be changed.
Right.
So something can be good today and less good in a year or in 2 years. And so it isn't obvious to me how we'd solve the problem of incremental modification.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that ties into, I think you've espoused that hierarchies are part of who we are. And when you unleash blockchain, essentially some new variation of hierarchy will creep up, and potentially more nefarious one simply because of the immutability of it and sort of the lack of punishment for crimes. Essentially, mm-hmm. That's a function that government solves. And so the question is, is there such a thing as a bottom up hierarchy? Can you get to a place where there's granular peace with these hierarchies because you have strong enough aligned interests, or is human nature always to pervert the hierarchy?
Well, we're going to find out. And I think it's interesting to see the experiments run. I think that's particularly true with Bitcoin, and it isn't obvious to me that so far it's been a nefarious force. So, and I like to see some competition on the currency front, especially in the face of the constant government, what would you call it, temptation to print money, which is, in my opinion, can be argued to be a form of theft.
Yes.
So
that's right. And inflation as theft, that's a Robert Breedlove staple.
It's also theft from the thrifty.
Yeah.
And they're probably the people you least want to steal from, because that means you're punishing people for not discounting the future.
Right.
And the people on the left who are often in favor of currency printing for good causes also don't want people to discount the future. Mm-hmm. That's part of their sustainability argument. Well, if you punish people by deflating their savings, then you punish them for not discounting the future. That's rather counterproductive in my estimation.
I agree. Final question. This is a little more in your wheelhouse. So one of the experiments we've been running in building metacities is we've put local news at the core of it. It's a civic mm-hmm. platform, right? And local news has long since held that position. And sort of a trickle down from journalism is sort of the rules of journalism, objectivity and certain professionalism. And so the experiment we've run for the last 3 years is we actually moderate every piece of content, community provided, or even the comments on the post, and we moderate them for civility. We don't mm-hmm. moderate for what the idea is.
And what are the rules you use to determine whether something is civil?
Yeah, and so my basic rule is: does it close the mind or open the mind to further progress of the conversation? Mm-hmm. And in a and again, does it stay on point? Does it devolve into identity related things? And is it stay on point to the actual issues?
Mm-hmm. How has your user base responded to your moderation?
Surprisingly and amazingly well, actually.
Okay, so then I would say that's a good regulatory principle in some sense, right? I mean, if you're testing out your policing, let's mm-hmm. say, in the confines of a market with people who are free to go elsewhere, then maybe you have a check on the proclivity for policing to turn into censorship.
Yes.
Because the line between those two is dreadfully thin, as we continually see.
Yeah, and that's the crux of my question. Our core tenet is, if you can explain, if there were another side to your discussion, if you could explain it better than them, you're winning, right? So the idea is that perspective, and that there are multiple perspectives. A house from any different angle is still the same house, and there's some truth in each of the angles that you're viewing that house. And so really understanding the difference between truth within perspective and truth between perspectives is kind of our core tenet.
Yeah, well, you'd think that if you get that right, that would increase your market value, essentially.
Yeah.
It's a very tricky needle to thread, obviously. And part of the reason that so many institutions have been captured in some sense is because that gatekeeping authority can be easily subverted into something that instantly becomes censorship.
Yeah.
So that's another example of how something that starts out good can degenerate across time and might need modification. You need a living voice in there in interaction with a broad populace to ensure that line stays where it's supposed to line it, where it's supposed to stay during constant transformations.
Yeah. And some of the sort of, the secret may be that it works in the micro, that maybe not in the macro, right? So if you think about...
well, that's another issue, right? Scaling, something that's huge does not necessarily operate by the same principles. I mean, there's a good rule of thumb, which is if you want to build something big, build something small and scale it.
Right.
But there's a countervailing principle, which is not everything scales. Like a giant ant, to take an example, can't function, right? Once it scales up to a certain point, its physiology no longer suits that volume, let's say. That surface area to volume doesn't work anymore. So those are tricky problems to solve.
Wonderful. I appreciate your time. I know you have to prepare for the evening, and I'm looking forward to hearing you and Michaela
Nice
speak
to
tonight.
see you again.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. All right.
Thank you so much.
You bet, man.
Really
Let me know
appreciate
when
it.
it's up.
I will.
Okay, ciao.
See ya.